Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Damrosch's second Tanner Lecture and the Tanner Lecture Symposium on Scriptworlds in Collision. I'm going to assume that most of you were at Dr. Damrosch's wonderful lecture last night and just jump in with a very quick introduction. David Damrosch is Ernest Birnbaum Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University and Director of the Institute for World Literature. He is a guiding and pivotal figure in the field of world literature, author of numerous field-defining works of scholarship, and one of the institutional linchpins of the global study of global literature. He is also an especially generous senior scholar, known for his support of students and up-and-coming scholars. In that spirit, we have organized a symposium of some of our most interesting assistant professors in the College of Humanities at the University of Utah, along with some special invited guests from across the country, to explore the concept of script worlds from a variety of angles and perspectives. As we heard last night, script worlds name the conceptual and technological tools of literacy that underwrite literate cultures. Recognizing the histories of cultures and literature as shaped by scripts as well as languages promises to be an extremely useful approach, a chance to examine comparative literacies as part of the study of comparative literature. Today's presentations will offer some initial explorations of script worlds, some test runs of the paradigm in both historical and contemporary case studies of cultural contact and conflict in East Asia and the Middle East. We'll start now with Dr. Damrosch's second Tanner Lecture, which will bring the concept of script worlds into more contemporary contexts. At 1:30, we will hear a panel on script worlds in collision in East Asia. And then at 3 o'clock, a panel on script worlds in collision in the Middle East. Before I turn things over to Dr. Damrosch, I'd like to add that as a student of the long history of comic narratives and quixotic readings, which is the way we live out our mistakes, and especially our mistakes of reading, I was especially delighted last night by Dr. Damrosch's discussion of the linguistic history of Babel, a scribal error based on a willfully false and polemical false etymology that becomes our paradigm for cultural miscommunication and misunderstanding. One culture's temple of gods becomes another culture's barbarian Babel. Yes, but are our own stories, our paradigms of understanding and even self-understanding themselves based on mistakes? Babel indeed, and Babel all the way down. You need to actually read that sentence to get its full effect. Finally, before I turn things over, I'd like to thank Beth James, especially for her help organizing this. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. David Damrosch to help us sort all of this out.
Thank you for, again, a very kind and also very substantive introduction. I think you can hear me okay in the room. In yesterday's lecture, I was describing the importance of writing systems as storehouses of cultural memory, and I discussed how people can take other cultures' memories on board and make them their own whenever they learn to write a foreign script, either as a result of conversion, as in Iceland, or compulsion, as in colonial New Spain. Today we turn to the modern era to look at the crucial role of languages and scripts in times of war. Here in my title slide, you can see examples from probably the two military conflicts that are most in people's mind these days. This was working, no, it's not. There we go. But on the left, Israel-Palestine, and on the right, Ukraine. And these are wars over language and culture as much as they are wars over territory. On the left, you see a road sign directing people to Tel Aviv and other cities. It's supposed to be trilingual, but some ultra-rightists, this is about 12 years ago, covered over the Arabic with slogans of their party, like bumper stickers. And then on the right, when the Russians occupied Mariupol 2 years ago, they took down the signs, which you see on the ground, Mariupol, and put up the Russian spelling of the city. One small letter difference makes all the difference. They just can't bear it. And the other thing, of course, they're leaving out, Mariupol had headed also in Roman script to signify openness to the West. And that's gone from Mariupol now. Already in 1877, in a pioneering journal of comparative literature with essays in a dozen languages, the Hungarian German scholar Hugo Melzel condemned the Russian repression of Ukrainian. As he says, and this is the title page of a journal with all these different titles and a worldwide editorial board, he says, a people, however insignificant politically, is as important as the largest nation. From this comparative polyglot standpoint, should be considered the ukaz of the censorship office of the Russian Ministry of the Interior of May 16, 1876, the previous year, which prohibits the literary use of the Ukrainian language. Now he uses religious language, very interesting. It would appear as the greatest sin against the Holy Spirit, even if it were directed only against the folk songs of an obscure horde of Kyrgyzs. I apologize to the many excellent Kyrgyzs, instead of a people of 15 million. In a time when certain animal species, such as the mountain goat and the European bison, are protected against extinction by elaborate and strict laws, the willful extinction of a human species or its literature, which amounts to the same thing, should be impossible. This is the earliest case I've ever seen of someone describing an endangered language as an endangered species. It's really an early eco-critical insight. Now, many other authoritarian governments have followed suit over the years. Here's a poster put up in Croatia in the Mussolini era, prohibiting Croatians from speaking or singing in Slavic. Solo la lingua italiana, they say. Scripts play an important role in the processes of ethnic self-definition and can be in a very positive sense. Here we have contemporary Berbers now teaching Tefinach, which is a script that they've reinvented from old Punic inscriptions from 2,000 years ago, because the Berbers, who had had a traditionally largely oral literature, didn't want to have to use the imperial Roman alphabet or the imperial Arabic alphabet. So they resurrect Tefinach, and it's now teaching it in schools. So scripts can serve enormously useful purposes of self-definition and protection of a small culture, but they can also artificially separate closely related cultures. So if we go back for just 1 minute to the ancient Near East, if you take the first person singular independent pronoun for I, perfect index of identity, if you look at it in Hebrew, Arabic, hieroglyphics, and cuneiform, you assume these are completely unrelated languages and terms. But if you see them in a common script, ani, ana, anak, anahu, not so different after all. This is all actually one very broad-based culture. Now, at the turn of the last century in 1899, the Danish Jewish scholar Georg Brandes describes language as a weapon in world literature. It is incontestable, he says, that writers of different countries and languages occupy enormously different positions, where their chances of obtaining worldwide fame or even a moderate degree of recognition are concerned. When a writer has succeeded in France, he is known throughout the world. But whoever writes in Finnish, Hungarian, Melzel's language, Swedish, Danish, Dutch, Greek, or the like, Danish being his language, is obviously poorly placed in the universal struggle for fame. In this competition, he lacks the major weapon, a language, which is, for a writer, almost everything. So he's already talking about the uneven playing field of world literature, of the sort that critics are talking about today, very rarely realizing, this was already discussed fundamentally by Brandes, who himself is an interesting figure because inside his Danish name is his other name, Georg Morris Cohen Brandes, really interesting bi-cultural figure. And he's best known for his Hauptströmungen der Literatur des 19. Jahrhunderts, which the major currents of the literature of the 1900s. in which his own Danish, let alone Yiddish, do not appear. It's French, German, Italian, and English. But his big study was translated into Yiddish early on, which is also quite interesting. So a language can be a weapon, and a script can be a trap. This we see in a really interesting 1984 novel, Milorad Pavic, The Dictionary of the Khazars. And Pavic, the Serbian writer, Pavic, describes the Cyrillic alphabet as a trap for Constantinople's Slavic invaders. While the Slavs besieged Constantinople in 860 AD, St. Cyril was setting a trap for them in the quiet of his monastic cell in Asia Minor's Olympus, that's Mount Athos. He was creating the first letters of the Slavic alphabet. He started with grounded letters. These are glagolitic. But the Slavonic language is so wild that the ink couldn't hold it. And so he made a second alphabet of barred letters, the true Cyrillic, and caged the unruly language within them like a bird, and broke the Slavonic language in pieces. Well, Pavic was dead serious in describing St. Cyril's script as an embodiment of violence. He published his novel in Cyrillic script in the waning years of the Tito regime, in the language then known as Serbo-Croatian. When Yugoslavia broke apart after Tito's death, Serbia split from Croatia, and the language was torn apart as well. Serbian and Croatian had been almost indistinguishable except in script, with Croatian typically being written in the Roman alphabet and Serbian in Cyrillic. Now they were declared to be different languages, and even a dictionary stopped at like the letter P or something. They couldn't even complete the dictionary of the language. It was no longer a language. But Pavic thought this was great. He took the opportunity to have his book translated into the Roman alphabet, as you see over here, from the original version here. In the case of the alphabetically arranged dictionary, the reading process changed because the order of entries changed. And so the Cyrillic Khazarski Rechnik became the Romanized Khazarski Rechnik, every word of which is identical, but almost every letter of which is changed. You can see also that language and script can not only create a national identity, but can assist in a very, can be liberating the nation, but it can also be repressing and the minority populations in the country. So I mentioned before the catastrophic success of the Turkish language reform in the 1920s under Ataturk to reorient away from the Middle East and towards Europe, and that's how it's usually understood. But it's not only that, because it also goes along with tremendous enterprise of ethnic cleansing in Constantinople and in Turkey overall, in Istanbul. Among other things, the new alphabet forbade by law the use of the letters Q, W, and X. This was justified as avoiding unnecessary letters, just as we saw yesterday with Iceland's first grammarian. We don't need it, why use it? But there was a political purpose as well. These letters are used for writing Kurdish names. The ban was only lifted. Interestingly enough, the ban was never enforced against, for example, the Xerox Corporation. That was okay, but if you were Kurdish, you'd better Turkify your name if you're going to write it. This was lifted only in 2013, not that long ago, 12 years ago, as part of a democratization package that Erdogan put together as he sought to get Turkey admitted to the European Union. Now, the repression of Kurdish was part of a larger project of linguistic and ethnic cleansing that began with the Armenian genocide in the World War I era. Then the Greek-Turkish population exchange of the 1920s moved 2 million Greeks out of Turkey and Turks out of Greece. And there's a really interesting book just published by William Strobel. It's his first book, which is also how exciting the field now of comparative and world literature is, that often the most interesting books are someone's first book. That would have been their second or third book a generation ago. This is how much is happening. And Strobel, as he details, the exchange carved up the edges of Europe and West Asia between two faiths, between two languages and alphabets, between two continents, and indeed two so-called civilizations, in an unparalleled act of mutual, state-sponsored ethnic cleansing. And hundreds of works were simply deep-sixed. These included Islamic poetry written in Greek, but using the Arabic alphabet. It included novels in Turkish written in the Greek alphabet by Orthodox Christians who have been expelled from Turkey to Greece. All kinds of mixtures going on. and Literature's Refuge. Very, very interesting. It talks about the migratory. It's a beautiful and quite poetic book. I recommend it highly. Now, language wars don't always involve bloodshed, but they can be quite intense even so. Take Romansh, a language spoken by a small minority in peaceful eastern Switzerland. But is it even a language, not some hybrid dialect of Italian? And this made me think of the famous definition. A Sprache is a dialect mit ein Armee und Float. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Well, of course, Romansh says neither an army or a navy. Switzerland does have a small army used for peacekeeping, interestingly enough. And for a long time, it was only a dialect, but it now has official status as one of the four official languages of Switzerland. And even the head of the lower house in Switzerland is from Romansh and greets people in Romansh, whether they like it or not, and then will self-translate later, as I found last year. So this is all very well. Good for Romansh. It's now on the map, on the linguistic map. And there you see it's that Romansh area there. But is it even a dialect, let alone a language, and not 5 dialects? This is the canton where it's mostly spoken. You have Sursilvan, Valader, Puter, the porridge eaters, Surmiran, Sutsevan, and a couple of dialects of the dialects. Then there is the normalized common script called Romansh Grishun, which they start trying to do in the 19th century, and trying to make a common orthography simply for these dialects. But you see how mixed it is, and it keeps going back and forth as to what's allowed, what is taught. But there were bitter debates as recently as the early 80s when the cantonal government promulgated a new common orthography, the Romansh Grishun, and bitterly disputed by partisans of one or another of the particular dialects. One describes this new orthography as a test tube baby, and another, in even more striking terms, that the day this was promulgated was a Kristallnacht for Romansh in its many versions. I mean, it's quite interesting choice of words. Well, sporadic attempts have been made to regularize Romansh as early as the 1600s, and then again gained momentum in the 19th century. Yes. Yesterday we'd seen how Nahuatl was often taught through the translation of foreign literatures. In the 1550s, Aesop, today, The Little Prince is available in 11 different indigenous languages of Mexico. So if you're learning your language now, you have a fun work of literature to use. Same thing was happening with Romansh early on. 1611, The True Joys of Young People is typically of that era, a teaching through Bible, patriarchs and Psalms of David, spiritual songs, and so on. There you then have here an orthography in the 19th century, the kind of thing that's going on, and this is orthography and pronunciation of one version of Romansh. And right now, you can learn Romansh studying it with one of 220 translations of Philip Winterberg's Bin ich klein. Amazing, just in 2013, already hundreds of translations around the world because it's so good for teaching the local language in schools. I tend to think that small countries love books about little people, as of course kids do as well. So there's a double benefit. And sure enough, what other text is very popular? Yes, The Little Prince, which you can get in the Romansh Grishun and in 3 of the 5 currently dialects. And the ones that are not there are spoken only by a couple of thousand people. So this is reaching very far into a market. And as the website proudly notes, with 457 translations, The Petit Prince is the second most often translated book in the world after, yes, the Bible. So we have this commonality there. Now, looking forward to today's panel on East Asian scriptwords, the rise of modern nationalism had immense consequences for writing throughout East Asia. And our panelists, who are real specialists in this, which I'm a pure amateur, will go into this more. But I'll give an example from Vietnam. The literati had always written in Chinese, traditionally, for hundreds of years, or else they would write in Vietnamese using a script based in Chinese characters, known as Chu Nom, or Southern characters, meaning the south of the Chinese script world, Chinese derived. So the work that is often treated as the foundation of modern Vietnamese literature, The Tale of Q by Nguyen Du, which he published in about 1800 or 1810. This is how it was written in the Chu Nam. In Vietnamese, in a local meter called the Loc Bat or 6/8, and you can see a line is 6 and then 8 characters of the caesura. It's a folk meter. He's very proud to be Vietnamese, and it's a rollicking, great verse novel. It exists in a couple of English translations. It tells the story of a heroine, Q, who has to sell herself into prostitution to survive in chaotic times, eventually achieving enlightenment as a Buddhist nun. As she resists bandits and thieves and negotiates her life, she becomes a stand-in for the poet, Nguyen Du, who had to switch his loyalty from one dynasty to a new one, and was he prostituting himself or not? The new one was supported by the French, who were looking to make their way into what would soon become French Indochina. In the course of the novel, Q becomes a metaphor for Vietnam itself. But the story is adapted from a Chinese novel. During the 17th century, Jesuit missionaries had developed what became the modern Vietnamese alphabet, and you see here the same verses there. Notice Chu Quoc, or the national script, very interesting. That's called, instead of Southern, it's national now, in the hopes of spreading Christianity. Well, it didn't really catch on at the time, but it was taken up at the turn of the 20th century by anti-colonial activists who wanted to increase literacy and political action among the people, among commoners. And so they transliterate the Tale of Q, as you see, celebrating it as a seminal national poem. Now, Nguyen Du had written in Vietnamese and in this look-back folk meter, but he identified equally with the Chinese tradition. It was absolutely not an either-or for him. Interestingly, in one poem, he compares himself to a Chinese woman poet whose verses had been burned by a rival, reading Shao Qing, Westlake Flower Garden, a desert now. Alone at the window, I read through old pages. A smudge of rouge, a scent of perfume, but I still weep. Is there a fate for books? Why mourn for half-burnt poem? There's nothing, there's no one to question, yet this misery feels like my own. In another 300 years will anyone weep, remembering my fate? Nguyen Du, 150 years later, half that time, is praised as a national hero by an important poet of the mid-20th century, Ke Lan Vien, and he's reflecting on this story. Born into those foul times of dusk and dust, you reached and touched no soulmate by your side. Your sorrow matched the fate of humankind. Q spoke your thoughts and crystallized your life. Kings rose and fell, the poem still abides. You fought and won your feats on waves of words. You planted stakes in the Bach Dang of time. Our language and the moon forever shine. It's a brilliant image. Going back to the 13th century, a Vietnamese general would plant stakes just below the waterline in this Bac Dang River going up to Hanoi to catch invading Chinese warships. So stakes in the Bac Dang of time. Very, very interesting. Made a national and anti-Chinese gesture, which would never have occurred to Nguyen Du. He goes on, though. He's not at all happy that Nguyen Du has made his story based on a Chinese novel. Why borrow foreign scenes? Our land flows not with one Gentang, but many fateful streams. Why split yourself? Nguyen Du had used some pen names. Nguyen Du, Ton Nu, Tan Hian. The tears in Q merge all three into one. Oddly, almost Christian. And he says, need we 1 century more to feel for Nguyen? Mourning our nightfalls, we soon grieve for his. We love king's calls to arms, yet we shall not forget those frost-white reeds along Q's road. Apparently, Ke Lan Vien feels that using a Chinese source is as inauthentic as hiding behind pseudonyms. And he's evoking directly his poem on reading the Chinese woman poet. Now, Chinese never entirely disappeared in Vietnam. As I saw in Hanoi some years ago when I was giving some talks there, this in the Ho Chi Minh Museum shop, here at this display. In the middle, we have a volume of poems written by Ho himself in classical Chinese. It was a hobby. He loved to do it. So he would write in 3 different scripts for different purposes: Vietnamese for local consumption, French for foreign consumption, and Chinese for himself. Next to it, you have a kid's biography, Abraham Lincoln, which may seem a little weird, but Ho Chi Minh saw himself as a new Lincoln, freeing the oppressed peoples of the South. And he originally thought that the U.S. should support him as a result. He was sadly disabused of that. Particularly interesting, I think, is on the right. here we have Tigger and Winnie the Pooh, and you wonder, oh, this is the worst kind of commercialization. Interestingly enough, inside what it turns out is it's Vietnamese folk tales, which are cleverly being marketed through a Disney cover by a company called the World Publishing Company. So it's a complicated linguistic and alphabetic history, and multiple even to this day. In Korea, you have a longer history of alphabetization going back to the 1400s, when King Sejong, in the first half of the 1400s, commissions the alphabet called Hangul, or Korean letters, in order to promote literacy among commoners. But Sejong himself was still deeply Sinocentric, as were all of his courtiers. If you see a portrait of him right next to a portrait of a Chinese emperor. And Hangul, the courtiers had no interest in this Hangul. And it only catches on again in the modern era, still often in a mix of Korean alphabet with still Chinese characters mixed in. But when Japan occupied Korea from 1910 to 45, the Japanese suppressed Korean and made Japanese the language of instruction in schools. After the country's liberation in 45, there was a general stripping away of Japanese, Chinese characters, and a great resurgence of national pride in the national script. And there's this huge new museum, I don't know, maybe it's 20 years ago, the Museum of the Alphabet in Seoul, that, of course, hordes of kids are brought in to see it, interactive, high-tech displays, but also grown-ups see it. And it's quite interesting. It'd be interesting to know if you know of any other museums of the script, of the alphabet. I saw an exhibit in the Republic of Georgia on Georgian scripts. I think particularly pride that you have one that nobody else has that's likely to stimulate this. So this is a great recovery of the national tradition, the script tradition, but also, as with Turkey language reform, a loss of Chinese heritage. As a result, this is thought about by an important mid-century Korean poet, Pak Dujin, inscription etched by water. One stroke at a time, now and then in spare moments, retracing the strokes with water during 10 times 100,000 years, I wrote one word. After a time, later again, quietly searching out the place. Then my hands touched, exploring gently, retracing each of the strokes. After passing yet again 10 times 100,000 years, I wrote one word. In the etched form of each stroke gleamed a gorgeous rainbow. In the sun's rays lighting the water, a rainbow of the currents. There were the times once when I listened, inclined my ear to the messages, but having heard, then afterward, recorded the inner sense of those words, now I find that after carving a few ancient characters year upon year for too long, I've completely forgotten what words I wrote. Turning now to the contemporary language wars, I'll talk about these two conflicts, Ukraine and Israel, Palestine. As Meltzel had noted, in 1876, the Russian Empire was suppressing Ukrainian, and this goes back as far as Peter the Great. And now, of course, Vladimir Putin thinks he's a new Peter the Great, and his henchmen are avidly Russifying the territories he's managed to occupy so far. In July 22, the city council proposed renaming occupied Mariupol as Zhdanov. This must be one of the most sickening urban improvement ideas that I've ever heard of. Zhdanov being Stalin's infamous head of propaganda, responsible for centralizing media under his control, repressing or murdering dissident writers and artists like Anna Akhmatova, among others. He was a native son of Mariupol. Stalin had the city named for him when he died in 48. Mariupol had gotten its name back on independence in 89. So that Russian renaming hasn't happened so far, but that has not stopped the propagandists from promoting Zhdanov. 2 months ago, you have the opening of the Zhdanov Museum in Mariupol. Very elegant little museum, with a chilling statement by the apparatchik from St. Petersburg who is overseeing it. Preserving historical memory is a strategic task. And I mean, this is how Orwellian can be, right? Preserving historical memory means erasing the actual history of the memory of the name of the city that it had for centuries, right? Now, starting with the Russian invasion of Crimea and the attack on the Donbass in 2014, there's been a flood of war poetry. I'll focus here on some poems that specifically relate to writing in the alphabet, which is a running theme in many of the poets' work. Thus, Leszek Panasiuk, in the hospital rooms of my country, which is the opening poem in this beautiful collection on the hour of war, from 2023. He'd had to escape from the town of Bucha, north of Kiev, one of the worst sites of massacres during the invasion in 22. And here, this is the opening poem in this collection. Letters of the alphabet go to war, clinging to one another, standing up, forming words no one wants to shout, sentences that are blown up by the mines in the avenues, stories shelled by multiple rocket launches. A Ukrainian word is ambushed. Through the broken window of the letter D, other countries watch how the E loses its head, how the roof of the letter M falls through. The language in time of war can't be understood. Inside the sentence there's a hole. No one wants to die. No one speaks. By the hospital bed of the letter Y lies a prosthesis it's too shy to use. You can see the light through the clumsily sewn up holes of the letter F. The soft sign has its tongue torn out due to disagreements regarding the etymology of torture. There's too much alphabet in the hospital room of my country. Too much alphabet. No place to stick an apostrophe. Paint falls off the walls, showering us with words incomprehensible, like men who in wartime refuse to speak. And another striking poem by Lyuba Yakimchuk, one of the most prominent contemporary poems, place names fall apart, like bombed buildings or decomposing bodies. The poem is called Decomposition, works particularly well in English. Nothing changes on the Eastern Front. That's ironic references to Erich Remarque's World War I novel, All Quiet on the Western Front. Invest in nichts Neues. Nothing changes on the Eastern Front. Well, I've headed up to here at the moment of death. Metal gets hot and people get cold. Don't talk to me about Luhansk. It's long since turned into Hansk, which I'm told means blame. Lu has been razed to the ground, to the crimson pavement. My friends are hostages. I can't reach them. I can't do Nietsk, which means a trough, to pull them out of the basements from under the rubble. Yet here you are, writing poems. Now she addresses herself, I guess, ideally slick poems, high-minded, gilded poems, beautiful as embroidery, which of course is a classic Ukrainian folk art. There's no poetry about war, just decomposition. Only letters remain. They all make a single sound. I stare into the horizon. At the end of the poem, I'll give you now the last verse. Her own name disintegrates. I stare into the horizon. It's narrowed into a triangle. Sunflowers dip their heads in the field, black and dried out, like me. I've gotten so very old. No longer Lyuba, whose name means beloved, just a Ba. And I'm told by a acquaintance who's a friend of hers that Ba was her nickname for her granny, her grandmother, like Baba. So it's really interesting thing. Another poet describes the difficulty of writing in wartime, but also affirms the need to bear witness. Boris Humaniuk. Not a poem in 40 days. Poetry went to the grave. When on November 23rd, Andrei Yuga, a fighter in the Un battalion, died in Battle of Tiski. He came from Lviv, nicknamed David. Poetry turned black, wore mourning clothes for 40 days. Then it was covered with earth, then with ash. 40 days, poetry sat in the trenches, clenching its teeth, shooting back in silence. Poetry didn't want to talk to anyone. What's there to talk about? Death? Poetry saw animals die, wounded cats and dogs dragging their spilling guts down the streets, as if this were something ordinary. Poetry didn't know what to do. Take pity and help them die, or take pity and let them live. It goes on. Poetry is a shortcut to heaven. Poetry sees into the void. When you fall, it lets you remember your way back. Poetry went places where there isn't a place for poetry. But then it ends with an affirmation, doubly repeated. Poetry witnessed it all. Poetry witnessed it all. The Ukrainian poets of war are often eyewitnesses who have been under fire. But witness can also involve engagement from a distance, especially for people writing in more global languages than Ukrainian. Arabic is spoken in dozens of countries, and writers from around the Arab world have attended to the Palestinian plight ever since the Nakba, or catastrophe, of 1948, when a group of Arab nations tried to overthrow the nearly established state of Israel and were repulsed, leading to the displacement and exile of some 700,000 Palestinians, and also the reciprocal displacement of hundreds of thousands of Mitzrayim, Jews living in Arab countries. In 1989, the Lebanese-born artist and poet Etal Adnan published an incantatory book-length poem, The Arab Apocalypse, peppered with hieroglyphs and evocations of many other scripts. So here you have the opening lines: a yellow sun, a green sun, a yellow sun, a red sun, a blue sun, a Hopi red Indian sun, an Arab black sun, a sun yellow and blue. Keep in mind, yellow and blue are the colors of the Ukrainian flag. Adnan condemns violence on all sides of the Middle Eastern conflicts. Her poem is filled with surreal images of violence and its effects on bodies, on the land, and on language itself. An ambulance, in one line, drives between two hedges of silence, while herds of poets manifest the dethroned power of words. Turned black from smoke, the sun becomes a coffin floating from one horizon to the other, while later on it becomes a word choking my throat, and speech disintegrates into solar particles, as we really see in this opening page. In the poem's closing lines, about 75 pages later, the blazing patriarchal sun gives way to night. In the night, we shall find knowledge, love, and peace. In 2012, the Moroccan writer Taha Ben-Jelloun published his remarkable poem, La Remontée des Cendres, The Rising of the Ashes. He wrote it in French. A friend of his translated it into Arabic, and it's published in a bilingual edition, which you have to read from two directions if you're reading it, because Arabic starts from the opposite side, so they meet in the middle. The American edition is bilingual English and French, so it loses that quality because now it's just on facing pages, but it's unique to this alphabetic differentiation of the original. Now, the best known Palestinian poet is certainly Mahmoud Darwish, who wrote sometimes from within Israel-Palestine, but often from exile. Here we see him shown with his good friend Edward Said. Among his best known poems, The Earth is Closing In on Us. Here's some of it. The earth is closing on us, pushing us through the last passage. We tear off our limbs to pass through. The earth is squeezing us. I wish we were its wheat so we could die and live again. Where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the birds fly after the last sky? Where should the plants sleep after the last breath of air? Edward Said used the line "after the last sky" as a title for my favorite book of his, a beautiful book about daily life in Palestine, while the Canadian artist Frida Gutmann used it for a photo collage. If you read the words on the page, it goes in order from bottom up to top, and the refugees disappear. But if you read it visually, as the eye naturally does, from top to bottom, they come increasingly into focus. Very interesting collage. Over the years, the sequence of wars has also led Israeli writers to offer their responses. Sometimes they express their horror at acts of terrorism, especially the attacks by Hamas a year and a half ago. Other times, the Israeli poets oppose their government's frequent treatment of Palestinians as second-class citizens and the endless conflicts that ensue, in patterns instilled in people from childhood on. In one poem, the writer ironically invokes the ever-popular children's text, Hanasich Hakatan, the Little Prince. Notably, this edition doesn't show the typical image of the prince on his mini planet, but here he's brandishing a sword. And it must be with this edition in mind that Meir Wieseltier writes Call Up. So they'll call the little prince, stick a submachine gun in his hand, and say, you might have come from another star, but now you're here. That's not an elephant you see from under the painted hat, but a tank. The lamplighter's a terrorist. If you don't wipe out those sheep, it'll be your head instead. That's how it is, little prince. Days after Hamas's horrific attacks on October 7, 23, an Orthodox Israeli poet wrote an agonized poem naming all the settlements that have been attacked. God of Ofakim, God of Be'eri, God of Zekim, God of Huli, God of Lachni, God of Israel, on and on. God of eyes won't be shut, God of the dead children, God of the burnt houses, God in affliction and captivity. What name shall I call out till you hear me? Pain struck, we've come to entreat you, and gathering the names, the faces, the fears, only the shofar bleating bitter. Ayacha, where are you? Another writer was moved to grimly recall the biblical story of the flood. What did actually happen? It's kind of a prose poem, I think of it, in the aftermath of the flood. Once the waters abated and the land was dry, people emerged from their shelters to discover the scope of the disaster, the ruined houses, the corpses, the mutilations. They discovered that the world of yesterday was no more. What remains are words without syntax, no sense, no sentence, solitary notes, obstructed enunciations, no window open, no rest for the soul, for the soul. The syntactic chain that binds the words together is broken. Here we see a recurrent theme in war poetry from many times and places, the fear that no words can adequately respond to massive violence, and conversely, a sense that in its very brokenness, poetry can give witness to traumatic and incomprehensible events. The most prominent Palestinian poet to have emerged from the last few years is Moussa Babu Toha. Having earned an MFA in the United States, he returned to Gaza, where he founded an English language library dedicated to Edward Said. You see him there at the library before its destruction with a Said reader in his hand. His first book, Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear, came out in 22 and won the American Book Award and several other prizes. And its title poem is dedicated to his doctor and advises her on how to stitch up his ear after he'd been wounded by shrapnel. Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear, for Alicia M. Quinnell, MD, probably from Doctors Without Borders. When you open my ear, touch it gently. My mother's voice lingers somewhere inside. Her voice is the echo that helps recover my equilibrium when I feel dizzy during my attentiveness. You may encounter songs in Arabic, poems in English I recite to myself, or a song I chant to the chirping birds in our backyard. When you stitch the cut, don't forget to put all these back in my ear. Put them back in order, as you would do with books in your shelf. But there are too many violent sounds stuck in his ear. Part 2, the drone's buzzing sound, the roar of an F-16, the screams of bombs falling on houses, on fields, on bodies, of rockets flying away, rid my small ear canal of them all. And then the poem ends on a sort of lyrical, tender note. Spray the perfume of your smiles on the incision. Inject the song of life into my veins to wake me up. Gently beat the eardrum, so that my mind may dance with yours, my doctor, day and night. Musab's second collection came out last fall. I get to know him. He was visiting us at Harvard for years as a scholar at risk. It chronicles the new collection, The Forest of Noise, chronicles the experience of living under bombardment from which he and his wife and the 2 kids recently escaped, though 30 of their relatives have died. One poem, Under the Rubble, is a set of short vignettes, some ironic, some heartrending, some both. Here's a few of the vignettes. A group of mute people were talking sign. When a bomb fell, they fell silent. I leave the door to my room open so the words in my books, the titles, the names of authors and publishers could flee when they hear the bombs. They couldn't find a stretcher to carry your body, and this is something he'd seen. They put you on a wooden door they found under the rubble. Your neighbors, a moving wall. What are you thinking? What thinking? What, you? Is there still you? You there? I'd like to end with one other poet who has witnessed languages at war from a distance, of language and also of region, the remarkable Kashmiri American poet Agha Shahid Ali, who died in 2001. He made his career in the US after self-exiling from Kashmir to get free from the long-running Hindu-Muslim conflict, which he memorialized in his collection, Country Without a Post Office. He was a great exponent of the ghazal, as in his last collection, Call Me Ishmael Tonight, published in 2001. The Persian Urdu ghazal is a set of loosely linked couplets, often described as a necklace strung with pearls, with a rhyme leading to the same final word in each couplet, often the poet naming himself at the end. And the reader or the listener has the pleasure of seeing how will the poet get back to that word with a new rhyme in each couplet. It's almost impossible to capture in translation, rarely tried, but we can see how it works from some couplets from one of the poems that Shahid Ali composed in English by exiles, notably dedicated to Said, and with a epigraph, that famous line from Darwish, where should the birds fly after the last sky? In Jerusalem, a dead phone's dialed by exiles. You learn your strange fate. You were exiled by exiles. By the Hudson lies Kashmir, brought from Palestine. It shawls the piano, Bach, beguiled by exiles. This scene would be Said's apartment overlooking Riverside Drive, his Columbia apartment, with his grand piano, and then a Kashmir shawl on it. Was, after the last sky, this the fashion of fire, autumn's mist pressed to ashes, styled by exiles? If the enemy is alone and his arms are empty, give him my heart, silk wrapped like a child, by exiles. Will you, beloved stranger, ever witness Shahid, 2 destinies at last, reconciled by exiles? In the long ghazal tradition, often there's a very creative ambiguity. Is the addressee God or a human lover or somebody else, the beloved stranger? One could imagine any of them. Particularly fascinating in this respect is Shahid's poem Arabic, which doesn't have any rhymes at all, the defining feature of the ghazal. It's as though he's translated it from Arabic, a language he couldn't speak, the language of a lost faith. The only language of lost left in the world is Arabic. These words are said to mean a language, not Arabic. Ancestors, you've left me a plot in the family graveyard. Why must I look in your eyes for prayers in Arabic? Who listens to Ishmael? Pun on Ishmael's name, God listening. Even now he cries out, Abraham, throw away your knives, recite a psalm in Arabic. From exile, Mahmoud Darwish appears again, writes to the world, you all pass between the fleeting words of Arabic. At an exhibition of Mughal miniatures, such delicate calligraphy, Kashmiri paisley is tied into the golden hair of Arabic. Next, he references the long-running Israeli-Palestinian conflict going back to the takeover in 1948. And here he cites both the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai and the Palestinian Anton Shamas, who writes mostly in Hebrew, though also at times in Arabic. The Quran prophesied a fire of men and stones. Well, it's all come true now, as was said in the Arabic. Memory is no longer confused, it has a homeland, says Shamas, territorialize each confession in a graceful Arabic. Where there are homes in Deir Yassin, you'll see a dense forest. The village was razed. There's no sign of Arabic. Literally, no more sign for the town, like with Mariupol. I, too, O Amichai, saw the dresses of beautiful women and everything else, just like you, in death, Hebrew, and Arabic, as though death is one of the trilingual languages here. They asked me to tell them what shahid means. Listen, it means the beloved in Persian, witness in Arabic. This is not all of the couplets, but it's a selection of them. Another poem turns to the wars in Iraq, including what Saddam Hussein memorably called the mother of all battles against the US back in 91. Here, Shahid wonders how to communicate in English to an American public about events so far beyond the Anglosphere, beyond English. No language is old or young beyond English. So what of a common tongue beyond English? I know some words for war, all of them sharp, but the sharpest one is jung beyond English. If you wish to know of a king who loved his slave, you must learn legends often sung beyond English. Baghdad is sacked. Its citizens must watch prisoners now in miniatures hung beyond English. Go all the way through jungle from Aleph to Zenith to see English like monkeys swung beyond English. As the poem ends, Shahid Ali hints that he himself is going beyond English. So never send to know for whom the bell tolled, for across the earth it is rung beyond English. When the phrase the mother of all battles caught on, the surprise was indeed not sprung beyond English. Could a soul crawl away at last unshriveled, which to its own fusing senses had clung beyond English? If someone asks where Shahid has disappeared, he's waging a war. No, jung, beyond English. First line here, of course, echoes John Donne's famous meditation on our common humanity in the face of death, which he wrote after surviving a nearly fatal illness. No man is an island, he declared. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. When Shahid Ali sent his collection to press, where was he going? To wage his war beyond English. As he worked in his collection, he himself was dying of a brain tumor at age 52. In his final poems, he confronts on a very personal level the greatest challenge that every poet faces, and many of us face in different ways, in any time and place and in any language: how to counter the forces of death and destruction, both in the wider world and in their own bodies. He closed this collection with one of his most moving poems, a ghazal that's just a single couplet long. Existed. If you leave, who will prove that my cry existed? Tell me, what was I like before I existed? Once again, who is the adversary? Is it God? Is it a lover? Is a poet speaking to the reader, closing the book? Or is it, my preferred interpretation, the poem itself, pleading with the poet not to die? I believe that this is the ultimate contribution that poetry can make to the articulation of human values in times when languages and cultures are at war, to bear humane witness in the face of inhumanity, and to create healing works that may outlast the poet's brief life and enter fruitfully into our collective cultural memory. I ended my talk yesterday by suggesting that the Norse god Odin, patron of poetry, might have foreseen the day when poets would celebrate his deeds and keep alive the memory of the raven whose name means memory. Well, for Shahid Ali, writing both in and beyond English, he bore witness to the wars of our time and the wars of the world's languages, from Hindi and Urdu to Hebrew and Arabic, from the Holocaust to Kashmir, and from Iraq to Israel-Palestine. And just as Uden would have wished, a quarter century after Shahid's death, his poems keep alive the poetry of witness by the poet whose name means witness. Thank you.